A couple of weeks ago, we ordered another batch of chickens. We ordered 53 Novogen Browns. Just got notified today. Come on, let me show you. When we received these this afternoon, 2 of the birds had already died, but the rest of them are doing quite well, quite vigorous. As you'll note, there's 3 lighter colored ones in there, and those are the 3 roosters. Sex-linked chicken is very easy to sex at birth. The sex of a sex-linked chicken is easily determined by the variation in color of the male and the female. This is a little rooster right here. The lighter color being the male, and the female being the darker, more brown, but these are both Novogen Browns. It's just that the roosters are lighter in color. The water trough that I use has a round bottom. What that does is it reduces the likelihood of the chicks being trapped in a corner. Because what they'll do is when they're either trying to stay warm, they're trying to thermoregulate their temperature, they'll group together. When they're spooked by something, they'll group together. And what can happen as a result of that, weaker birds can get trapped in a corner and then they can suffocate. It's very nice to be able to utilize a brooding vessel that reduces that risk. The other nice thing about utilizing this for a brooder for me is just that I get to utilize it for its intended purpose when I'm not brooding chicks. This also has another function that can be utilized on my property. I've got a zip tie that holds up the light that's attached to this C-clamp. Let me turn their light back on. I think they'd appreciate that at this point. And so that'll quiet them down quite a bit. Now they're a little bit more calm. This is the waterer I use. I want this area to be as small as possible because I don't want them to get in there and drown themselves. One of the things that you can do is you can put just some rocks in there, which will keep them from actually getting themselves caught in there and drowning. I typically put it on top of a board, which helps to keep them from kicking a bunch of the shavings in there. And then I'll do the same thing with their feeder. Yeah, this is what I use for the feeder. I've got a couple of these that I can throw in there, a couple of those same waterers that I showed. And that will keep them pretty satisfied for about the first 2 weeks. They've been in that box for 48 hours or more. And so they're all probably quite thirsty. Beautiful part is that when one or a couple of them winds up doing that, the rest of them are going to learn from them. They'll be able to regulate their own body temperature by moving away from the light if it's too hot, or moving closer and huddling together up underneath there. Now, the one real downside to this style of heat lamp is there is a potential for fire risk. However, I think the risk is pretty minimal. It does have a guard on it. It's pretty secure. Very happy with the time frame of when these birds arrived, which is not to say that we won't potentially lose more, but of the 54 birds that were shipped, we've only lost 2 of them at this point. Now, one of the things that I like to do with these style feeders is I will take off this lid for at least the first 24 hours. That way it gives them free access to learn where this food is at. They're going to go ahead and poop in all of this and kind of make this a mess, but at least they will have complete and full access to knowing where the food's at, in what location, and kind of what the vessel is. And then after 24 hours, I'll go ahead and put this lid back on, and then they'll be able to figure out, you know, that they need to put their head in here. It just makes it a little easier to transition for them, because at this stage of the game, a lot of these birds are in a more of a weakened state potentially, and you need to get them the food and water that they're going to need to, you know, have a good chance for survival. Typically, the hatcheries will throw in a bird or 2 extra. And in our case, this time we got 1 extra bird. Yeah, the lid that I have for this is just cut out of plywood, and it's got a couple of vents on the top. It's got a little cutout there, a little slot for the C-clamp that goes on. Yeah, I can open this up on this end, slide it over, or I can take something like a pallet sheet, push that down, and there's a screw right here that I can pop that through. It just kind of helps to hold it from wanting to move back and forth. And then they'll be good, just like that. Yeah, one of the downsides to brooding your chicks in the wintertime is just the fact that you have to keep them in the brooder for a little bit longer, because they're going to have to stay in here until they're feathered out well enough to be able to keep themselves warm. And of course, in the wintertime, with the colder temperatures, that's going to take a little bit longer. The good part about it is that these hens at least from what we've had in the past, will start laying right around 20 weeks. Actually, they started laying last year right at around 18 weeks. And by 20 weeks, they were all fully laying. And all these hens will be fully producing by the middle of June. So I actually kind of like personally to get my hens a little earlier than this, somewhere around November. Just some of the considerations that you might need to take as far as when you want to get your birds. Didn't lose any overnight, and it looks like they've gone through all of their food, and all these birds wound up powering about half of that water. So I'm gonna have to add another feeder and another waterer in here for them today, now that they've got things kind of sorted out. Now, this feeder was in there for about 5 minutes and nobody had messed with it. And one wound up coming over, and within 2 seconds, this is about what you'll see. Because they learn so quickly from one another that now they're all very curious, and they're gonna come over and investigate. And they'll quickly learn where their food's at and how to best get after it. I typically don't put a lot of food in there, just a few handfuls, because they'll wind up walking all over the top of that, making a mess of it. But I put up about as much as they can consume in a 24-hour period, at least for the initial part of, so I can see how everybody's doing. We've had these chicks now for 4 days in the brooder, but they're a total of 7 days old, and I wanted to show you what they look like and what it looks like inside the brooder. There's also been 2 additional that have died. So we had 2 in transit that died, and we had 2 since they've been in this brooder. They haven't done anything over here, but you can see where all of their activity's been concentrated. But this will give you an idea of about how much manure they're gonna accumulate in about the first 4 days. By the second week of their life, they're gonna be a lot more active and a lot more well-established, vigorous. They're going to be consuming a lot more food and water. They're going to be producing a lot more manure. It's another reason why you need to have something to contain them, because they will be able to fly out of this within 2 weeks. You can start to see there's starting to get their actual little feathers now. One of the things I'm going to have to pay very close attention to is a condition that young chicks in the first few weeks of their life are very susceptible to. It's a condition called pasty butt. I created an earlier video on that very topic, and I'll put a link in the description. And so technically this is called vent gleat. Here's another one that's going to need to be addressed over here. This one here, it's even worse. As you can see, that's pretty chunky, and that'll close that off to the point where they won't be able to poop. Generally put it under some warm water and kind of get it to soften and break loose. Yeah, that one there is going to have to be washed for sure. So I need to grab that container, get a little warm water in it, and we'll wash that one, and maybe just inspect to see if there's any others that have it. Because if you don't at least look for that every day, then chances are, depending on how many birds you have in your brooder, that can easily get beyond you, and then you'll wind up losing one of these guys, and it's totally preventable. Well, it's now 6 days later, and these little guys down here are rapidly outgrowing their food and their water system that I currently have them set up with. But now that they are at a point where they're not going to wind up getting caught and drowning in their watering system, and they've got the eating figured out, I'm going to go ahead and upgrade them to something a little bit larger. Yeah, what I'm going to do is to remove these smaller watering units and upgrade them to something a little larger. This is a 5-quart container, and then their feeder is a 10-pound. This is a hanging feeder. I like using these. These are actually what I use for my full-grown birds in their pen, because I like to keep the food suspended up so that they're not kicking a bunch of stuff in, and then they can easily access it. So I like these feeders quite a bit. This is merely something that I kind of came up with. So I'll put a link in the description further explaining what this is all about. They wound up going through all that feed last night, so as you can see, they're quite hungry. Got quite good appetites, and I actually should be adding another feeder to this, which I will probably do, just so that they all have plenty of room to get around it and get the food and the nutrition that they need. As you can see, the chicks still have full access to being able to get their head in there to get the food as well as the water. But what it does is it prevents them at this stage of their life from actually getting up and walking and either getting stuck in there or making a mess. Typically is what they'll do, is stand up in there and then they'll wind up using the bathroom. So this just prevents them from doing that. And as they get larger, this won't be necessary. But at this stage of their life, when they're still fairly small, I found that it's really a simple and low-tech fix to improve upon the design of this when using with small birds. We're going to be keeping about a dozen of these birds for our own personal use. The remainder is going to be going out to friends and family for use on their homesteads. If you have any questions as it relates to these birds or any others, feel free to leave a comment. Please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.